Okay. Meanwhile, back in jolly old England, we had been talking about the French explorers. So now we've got to move on to what the British were doing. And so while the French were exploring, there was a lot of drama going on back over in France. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. And here's our timeline again. So we've already covered the Spanish explorers in the late 1400s. Then we had the French explorers in the 1500s, and now we're moving on up into the 1600s with the British. And let's find out what they're going to do, because they're going to make the biggest difference to our country. So these, like I said, while these men, and we already talked about who they were, Pineda, de Vaca, de Soto, and de Luna. While they were exploring America, there was a lot of drama going back in England going on. And it all really centered around this man right here. And his name is King Henry VIII. And if you've ever heard of him, he was the one with all the wives. If you haven't heard about him, I'm going to teach you just a little bit. But he was married to this lady. She was a Spanish princess. And her name was Catherine of Aragon. And so, no, yes. So, yes, that's who it was, Catherine of Aragon. And they were married for 25 years. And he really wanted a son, however, so that he could pass the crown on to his son. Well, she could only have a daughter, and that was the only child she could have. And so her name was Mary. Let me get rid of this little box right here. And her name was Mary. And so that was the only daughter they could have and only child they could have. And so he got a little upset about that, and he wanted a son. So he divorced Catherine, and he married another lady named Anne. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and you will always know her because when you see her picture, there's a bee. See the little bee on her necklace? That's Anne Boleyn, the second wife. And she, unfortunately, could not have a son. She could only have a daughter, and her daughter's name was Elizabeth. So Henry, by this point, had two daughters, one named Mary and one named Elizabeth, and still no son. And by this point, he had already divorced one wife. So divorcing another, he just couldn't do that. So he had to come up with a way of getting rid of Anne Boleyn. And so he said she was treasonous. Treasonous means that she did something that she spoke out against the British government or about him. She wasn't truthful. She wasn't loyal. And so back then, that was a crime punishable by death. And the way they did it back in England is they would chop your head off. So yes, they would chop your head off. So let's start following along. There's a little pattern here. He divorced, and then he beheaded, and then after he beheaded this lady, he got married again, and again, and again, and again. And so there's a funny pattern, okay? Because he got a son by this third wife, but she died after childbirth, and then the son only lived to be a teenager. So he did get a son, but like I said, he only lived to be a teenager. So then he married again, and he married this German lady. He didn't like the way she looked, so he divorced her again, but she ended up being his very best friend. Very best friend. She ended up doing better than all of these other wives. She got more palaces and more money than any of the other ones did because she was his best friend. And then this one was flirty, so he had her beheaded. And then he died, and then this one survived. So here's a pattern. What they teach the children in England, how they teach them to remember it, it was, here's a little rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's a little saying, okay? Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So, like I said, there's a lot of drama going on back in England, but everything is going to focus now on this princess right here, Princess Elizabeth. She would become Queen Elizabeth the First, one of the most powerful queens in the history of the world. And so we're going to move on to her because it's from her we get some other things in history. Here's her famous portrait later on, and we're going to talk more about this portrait in a minute. Okay. And if Queen Elizabeth sounds familiar to you, that's because The current Queen of England is also named Elizabeth, but please note they are 300-400 years apart. They do not have to go in order. So Elizabeth I lived in the 15 to 1600s, and she was a very powerful queen. But then there were many other. She had no children of her own, so it passed to a cousin, and he's the one that's going to become the founder of America, right? So anyhow, this queen was in the 1600s. Many years later, we have this queen, Queen Elizabeth II. And that was her when she was younger, and this is her today. She's in her 90s, and she still goes to work every day. She's considered an equal to this one in history. And so you look for her. She's going to be on the front of magazines every time you go to the grocery store. If you look for one of those magazines on the rack, you'll see Queen Elizabeth. So Queen Elizabeth, when she was younger, there she is. And this is her as an older lady. But when she was at the height of her monarchy, she was known for starting something that we still have today, and that's the spy business. And pirates. She started pirates. So I want you to look closely at her outfit. If you notice her clothing right here, it has some little symbols on it. If you look real close, you're going to see some little eyes and some little ears. And this was before the painting kind of faded. This was a rainbow shape. It's called the rainbow portrait for several reasons, but because it means the dawn of a new age. I mean, she's more powerful than anyone else. England is going to be stronger than any other country, and that's kind of what it symbolized. But this dress was also sending a message to other countries and to people inside her own country that I can see and hear everything. And that's because she was the first to have a spy network. And this video right here is in all the libraries. You can get it. It's a PBS video. It's a documentary. It's really cool. It tells you all about how she started spies and how the networking operated. It's really cool how she did that. And if you've ever heard of, I didn't mean to go there. Okay, if you've ever heard of the term eavesdropper, that's a vocab, not a vocab word for the test, but it is a vocab word for you to know. Eavesdropper. That's a name for a person who listens in on private conversations. Well, that word comes from this room right here. This room was in Queen Elizabeth I's father's palace, big old Henry VIII we saw, the one with all the wives. He built this palace. And this was the great hall where if you came to visit the king, this is the room that you would go in, and he would be down here. And it would be full of people just standing around, no tables right here. They would just be standing around waiting for a chance to get to talk to the king. And while they were talking, who knows what kind of conversations they might have been having. So Henry VIII had placed way up here in the eaves of the building. That's what these rafters are called that hold up the ceiling. Okay, they're called the eaves of the roof. He had these tiny little faces, these little wooden heads. Here's one right here, and here's another one right here. Okay, and there's one peeping over right there. He had them placed all along the eaves up there because they were a symbol to the people down here that no matter what you talk about, my people, my spies can hear what's going on. They're listening in on your conversations. Not that these little wooden heads could actually listen in, but they were symbols. They were reminders to the people down here on the ground that we can hear everything that you're saying. And so the term eavesdropper, because these little guys were in the eaves of the building, that's where it comes from. So if you listen in on other people's conversations, you are an eavesdropper. So let's keep going. All right. We can take time to do the productive thinking right now. And if you've got time, we can stop the video and let you do that because it's interesting to think about the many varied, unusual problems that Queen Elizabeth I might have faced. But I'm going to keep going because we need to get moving. So let's move on up to Queen Elizabeth's first explorer, Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh came over, and notice where he came in. He came in off the coast of around Virginia, okay, around the middle of America, maybe a little above Virginia, but that's where he came in, Sir Walter Raleigh. And there was a funny thing back in the people used to like to play jokes in the 1950s. So 400 years later, this little joke was going around. Sir Walter Raleigh was known for a lot of things, but in addition to being a great explorer, he was known for being a very wealthy tobacco farmer. He grew lots of tobacco, and tobacco back then was not known to harm anyone. And it was a very, only wealthy men could smoke pipes, big, huge pipes, and cigars. And so it was a very popular thing to do, especially among the wealthy members of the English class. But 400 years later, over in America, men were using it as just tobacco for their pipes, and they would get it in this little can at the grocery store. And so one of the funny little jokes that kids like to do is they'd call up the manager of the grocery store, and they'd say to the manager, "Excuse me, do you have Sir Walter Raleigh in the can?" And the manager would say, "Yes, we do." And then the kids would say, "Well, you better let him out before he smothers," and laugh and then hang up the phone. They thought that was funny. So the Sir Walter Raleigh joke was going around a long time. Sir Walter Raleigh in the can. But that's just a little side note, a little funny thing. But let's find out what he really did. Sir Walter Raleigh found he tried twice to find the first permanent colony, but they both failed for many reasons. The Indians, they didn't get along very well. He also did not come along with enough supplies. There were just hardships that they were not prepared for. So Virginia, the first few colonies under Sir Walter Raleigh, they were established, but they did not stay around. In fact, one of them became known as the Lost Colony, or the mystery of the Lost Colony. When a man that was supposed to go back and get supplies for them couldn't return for 2 years later, when he finally did return, there was no one left in that last colony, but there was a strange word carved into the wood of the wooden fort that was left behind, and it was this word right here, Croatoan. Croatoan. No one knew what that stood for. There was no tribe named for that. No one could make any sense out of what that word was or why it was carved into the side of the fort. But there were no remains of any. There were no burials. There were no signs of a massacre of any kind. It's just a mystery what happened to those people in that second colony of Sir Walter Raleigh's. But bottom line is that they both of his failed, and it wouldn't be until a little later that we would get our first permanent colony. And so we're going to move on to that. But just know that Sir Walter Raleigh established the first two colonies, but they never took off. And so, again, we can stop and spend some time and think about these two questions here. If not, we'll keep going, which is what I'm going to do, okay, because we need to keep on. Here's a little quick note about how pirates came to be. They were actually created by Queen Elizabeth I. She, being powerful like she was, and remember, England, France, and Spain were always at war with each other, always. And she was quite jealous that the Spanish were finding gold all over the new lands they had discovered across the ocean in South America and around Mexico, California, but they were bringing back lots and lots of gold. If you remember the Spanish explorer De Soto, that's what he was always looking for, was more and more gold. That's what he wanted. And the Spanish were finding it. So their ships that were coming back, one of my students said one time that this is like a cookie, but it's not. It's a piece of gold. And this is what it looked like. It had the stamp, the Spanish royalty stamp on it. The Spanish ships would come back across the ocean loaded with gold. And so what Queen Elizabeth did is she turned an entire fleet of sailing ships into what she called privateers. They legally, under her, would stop the Spanish ships and take the sailors as hostages and turned them into more British soldiers. They would kind of like make them slave soldiers, and then they would steal all the gold and bring it back to Queen Elizabeth. And that was considered, there was no such thing as a pirate. No, there weren't pirates back then. But this group of privateers, for many years, that's what they did for Queen Elizabeth legally. Well, several years later, when that no longer, when the Spain couldn't take that anymore, and things happened, that had to cease being. That had to stop. So there were no when once those privateers no longer had jobs because that was now considered illegal. Queen Elizabeth's law had to be stopped. These men didn't know any other line of work. They were only trained to stop ships, steal them, and steal everything on them. And they figured, well, if we already know how to do that, why don't we just do that for ourselves? It might be illegal, but at least we'll get lots of money and we will have a way of living. And so that was the beginning of the first pirates. Once they started doing what they were trained to do under Queen Elizabeth, but now they were doing it illegally, now they were called pirates. And they were still stopping Spanish ships for gold. And that's what they did. And so the flag, they had to come up with a flag for themselves because they couldn't fly the British flag anymore because they weren't legal. They were doing something illegal. So their new flag became this pirate flag. But that's the beginning of pirates. Now, let's move on to the next slide. All right. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, that's the question. Remember, King Henry VIII had to have a an heir. He had to have a son to keep on. Well, he didn't. He only had two daughters, and the son died when he was a teenager. So, and Queen Elizabeth's sister, older sister Mary, she had died. So Queen Elizabeth had nobody to pass it on to. The only other person that could take over was a cousin, and his name was James the First. And we're going to pick up there in the next lesson because there's a lot to talk about. He is going to be the very first king of England to rule over us as Americans in this country. He's going to find the first permanent colony. Sir Walter Raleigh's two colonies didn't work under Elizabeth, and so King James the First, he's going to actually get one that takes off and stays permanent. And that place is still there today. You can go visit it. So we will pick up here tomorrow, but there is a study guide that you need to get started on. Oh my God.